Oh, I love when my screen moves. There it is. And welcome to another exciting episode of The Energy That Surrounds Us. I'm your host, Michael, and I have a little bit of housekeeping before we get to our awesome guest. So please, everyone, bear with me. You'll be excited about this. The housekeeping news that I have is that there is now a website for all of the shows, so you can reach me there. I will put the address up toward some point in the show. And we are airing for the first time on rumble.com. So we thank them for allowing us to air on their network. So we are always excited and appreciative of our networks. Now, with all that boring housekeeping out of the way, let us switch over and let me introduce our guest tonight. She is someone I have been looking forward to speaking with. I give you Vicki Joy. How are you?
Hi, Michael. I am doing great. And thank you so much for having me on the show. This is going to be fun.
It will be. And I have to say, your little packet that I got had me so many things about it. I was like, wait a minute. And when I saw the book that we were going to be, that you had so many more, I was like, wow. How have I not heard this name before? But for people who are tuning in and apparently haven't seen you on the multitude of podcast shows that you've been on, could you give the audience a little bit of background about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my name is Vicki Joy Anderson, and my latest book is called They Only Come Out at Night, Exposing the Dark Weapon of Sleep Paralysis. And that was published through L.A. Marzulli's publishing house, Spiral, I want to say Spiral of Life, but L.A. Marzulli published it, and it's available on lamarzulli.net. I have a bunch of other books you can find on my website, vickijoyanderson.com, but I'm a writer, and you know what, Michael? I just kind of started out thinking in my youth. I went to school, I got a degree in writing, and I kind of just thought I was going to write on, self-help and encouragement articles for women, and just the typical kind of stuff that most women from the 70s and 80s would write about. But my interest was really always in the supernatural. And I was born and raised in an evangelical sort of setting, and I would go to like Baptist churches and non-denominational churches and all that. And it always blew my mind that the Bible, if you read it from the context, the culture, the language, the history, the geography, if you really read it in context, it is an extraordinarily supernatural book. But you would never know it from going to church. The supernatural has been stripped completely out of it. And having suffered from sleep paralysis my entire life, I really didn't like the church's explanation as to what was happening to me and why. And I find that most pastors are grossly uneducated in this topic and ill equipped to counsel people in their church that are suffering from this. And so I think the reason that I was really willing to put myself on blast, I'm sort of an introverted, somewhat private person, and this is a very vulnerable topic to talk about. And I think that the reason I became willing to write about it so openly is I found out that thousands and thousands of people are going through this. And a lot of them are disoriented by it. They're perplexed by it. They feel harassed. They feel targeted. I understand that there are people that have harnessed sleep paralysis very intentionally, and they use it as a portal into the astral realm, etc. But the audience of people that come to me and that read my book and that want to counsel with me, etc., are the ones that don't know why it's happening to them and they want it to stop. So that's kind of my primary audience. So that's kind of where the book got birthed in a nutshell, and kind of where the trajectory of where my writing is going from this point forward.
I like how you say weaponized because it is a form that is fairly unknown. And when I saw that in your packet, that was one of the things that jumped out at me. I was like, I got really excited because I was like, oh, I get to talk to someone about sleep paralysis because it's like you mentioned that to a lot of people, and they're like, oh, that's just, fear of this or that is, or a bad dream. And, it's like, and I'm like, no, there's got to be something more to it. So I like how you coined the term weaponized it. And so, what is for you, how do you define someone who isn't like just scared and like hear the noise and like freezing versus sleep paralysis? How do you tell
Yeah,
the difference?
yeah. So I'm going to explain like a classic case of sleep paralysis. This is what most people will include in their story if they're going to tell you about their experience. And just understand, if there's anybody listening, that if you have experienced things that fall outside of this description or go beyond this description, that it absolutely is still sleep paralysis. But what most people are willing to share is that they wake up, or at least they perceive that they have woken up, because they're looking at what they believe is their bedroom. And in this altered state of consciousness, they feel as though they cannot move. People will describe feelings of, I can't breathe. I feel like I'm being choked. There's a lot of like chest, neck, throat sort of imagery that is usually in these stories. Um, People will talk about either seeing or sensing a very ominous presence in the room. And they will feel like this presence is very aware of them, and that there is some sort of an agenda there. So this isn't just a normal nightmare. It's usually an encounter where you're visualizing the room in front of you, and you're seeing or sensing some sort of ominous presence. And the most common things that people report seeing is the shadow man, the hat man, an incubus or a succubus, a old woman, a woman in a rocking chair, alien grays, parts of the room that are blacker than black, the red glowing eyes, those are the most common, but you also hear people talking about spiders, snakes, nanobots, angels, familiar spirits. Like familiar spirit would be, it looks like grandma, it looks like a relative who's passed on, or it looks like another human being. And then there is more of a material human aspect to sleep paralysis. And that is more of a witchcraft or a militarized version where you are in an altered state of consciousness. You're waking up, you're perceiving that you're seeing your room, but rather than an entity or some sort of astral creature or being, you're seeing an actual person that's familiar to you in real life who's still alive. And that is typically either a remote viewing or an astral projecting of someone into your room for surveillance purposes. And that is something that people talk about more on the targeted individual military occult end of it.
So I'm curious with, I appreciate you bringing up the alien part and possible abduction tie-in, because I know that's a controversial topic that a lot of people don't want to discuss.
Yep.
But I'm also kind of curious in that for those who are experiencing sleep paralysis through these means, what can they do to help stop it from happening again, like prevent it?
Yeah. Yep. There's a lot of things. I'm going to go from the most practical, and then we'll get a little bit more into the spirituality aspects of it. Practically, just like with anything, the better we take care of ourselves, the more mentally and physically robust and healthy and prepared we're going to be. And so if we are extraordinarily jet lagged, if our circadian rhythm is out of whack, if we don't sleep well, if we don't get deep sleep and REM cycle sleep, if we are extremely stressed out, or if we have a lot of drama in our life, if we have childhood trauma, if we are not eating well, if we're just junk fooding ourselves to death, obviously the things that we do for basic mental and physical health are going to protect us, because I do find that we are more prone towards these attacks when we are out of whack, when we're exhausted, we're stressed out. If we're going through grief or trauma, the loss of a job, a stressful move, you're going through a divorce or a relationship crisis, the more we are sort of psychologically, mentally, and physiologically out of whack, the more vulnerable we're going to be. So the number one thing is always to just be taking good care of yourself physically. Now, some of the more spiritual aspects, and I'm specifically saying spiritual and not religious, because this is advice that I'm giving to everybody. We are all spiritual beings, regardless of whether or not you go to church or you have a denomination or were raised in the church. But most people who have experienced this do understand that there is some sort of supernatural, spiritual element to this. They're engaging with supernatural beings. And sometimes those beings are perceived as evil, and sometimes they're perceived as being friendly. Whether or not they really are, we don't know. But the fact of the matter is, we are encountering these other dimensional beings. And so some of the things that we have to do is we have to learn how to navigate that culture, their dimensional cultures. And so this kind of actually overlaps a little bit with vampire lore, Michael. It gets really interesting. And I do go into depth in my book in chapter 4, Astral Vampires and Threshold Covenants, that these entities that usually show up at our doorway, they're waiting for that invitation. And that's the big secret that a lot of people don't understand. These things cannot harass us without permission. Now, unfortunately, they have ways of seducing and wooing and deceiving and tricking us into giving that permission. These are very legalistic beings. And so one of the ways to keep them out of your bedroom is to either not give them their permission to begin with, or you need to revoke the permissions that have been given to them. And so this involves learning the ways to ward them off when they come into your room. And, a lot of people, especially in the church, they put a lot of emphasis on if you say the name of Jesus, like in the name of Jesus, get out, that's a 100% fail proof way to get them out of the room. And it does work for a lot of people, Michael. It even works for people who aren't religious, but it's actually not fail safe. It doesn't work for everyone. And it doesn't work every time, and it doesn't necessarily work consistently. Invitation doesn't have to be, please come in. And a refusal to invite doesn't have to be, in the name of Jesus, get out. I've heard plenty of people just say, get out, and they'll go, or you have no right to be here, or I don't want to speak to you. Because the more we engage with these things, when you engage, it's a form of permissions. It's a form of invitation. And so you'll always hear the people that talk about, what's your name? Where did you come from? Why are you in my room? What do you want? And granted, Michael, we're all curious about these things. Even if we're scared, when these things show up, it's hard not to want to interact with them. I see this even in the realms of deliverance ministries, where you have different ways that people interact with demon spirits if they're trying to cast out spirits. Some are just like, get out, where others are, what's your name? Where'd you come from? And they're trying to glean all this information. But that really is dangerous ground, because as soon as you're interacting with them, you are giving them permission. That's the permission to interact with you. And so just knowing some of those things up front, the complex piece of it, Michael, is the people that have already opened the doors. And that doesn't mean you've intentionally opened the doors. There are many ways these doors can be opened. These doors can be opened on your behalf. It can be opened through witchcraft. It can be opened through ancestral ties, to whether if you've got someone in your background, great grandparents, etc., who were in secret societies, who might have done rituals. If you're from a generational occult family where these rituals have been done over you in the womb. So basically what I'm trying to say there, Michael, is it's not always the person's fault. In the church, when you go and you try to explain to someone in the church that this is happening to you, the answer you're most likely going to get is, what did you do? How did you open this door? Did you play with the Ouija board? They're looking for what you did wrong. And I just want to make it abundantly clear to everyone listening that sometimes these doors are opened by other people on your behalf, but you're in a vulnerable position, or you're under that person's authority, or that person has some sort of legal ground over you. And there's been some sort of ritual done. And this can be done through deception and trickery, Michael. It can be the receiving of a charged object, a gift that's been given to you, or a piece of food or clothing that has been charged, or a ritual's been done over it. There's numerous ways these doors can be opened, but the permission was not always granted by the person who is being attacked. So there's sort of a lot of knowledge that does have to go into this. And as soon as you start dealing with the person who is not open-minded to the spirit realm, who is not open-minded to the fact that there might be angels or demons or a spirit realm or paranormal or supernatural, it's really hard to help those types of people or get help from those types of people, because the concept that there are people or military personnel or certain cults or religious groups or societies or actual entities in another realm harassing human beings is just too much for them to wrap their mind around.
Right, and I can understand that. And one of the things that I'm finding interesting as well is, growing up, I grew up in metaphysics, not through the dogma. And one of the things that I was taught and learned was, as we're talking about, revoking permission,
Mm-hmm.
you can clean a space and it leaves. But what people fail to understand is, when you turn around and say, "Oh, I'm so glad that so and so has left the house now and we are free of that," you have just reopened the door for them to return. And I find that that's one of the hardest things for people. And I myself, struggle with that because it's like, how do I think that it's gone without bringing it back? It's like, because it's just the mere mention of it opens that door, and it's like, it's hard, like you were saying, for people not to say, oh, yeah, you remember that spirit I had? Well, it's gone. Well, that's a natural instinct. But then again, you just now reopen the door.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good point, Michael. These particular entities, the ones that are assigned to the sleep paralysis victims, they are attention seeking, narcissistic little imps, right? They love attention. Whether you're scared, whether you're intrigued, whether you're angry, whether you're turned on, there's 4 or 5 basic reactions that human beings have to these things. They're intrigued, they're terrified, they're seduced, or they're angry, right? And all of these are very powerful energy drawing emotions. They in themselves, those emotions in themselves can be invitations. And a lot of times what I see when people are inflicted with sleep paralysis, there's almost this double-edged sword. On one hand, they hate it and they want to get rid of it and they're frightened of it and they don't like it in the moment. But in the waking world, it's great creepy pasta, right? You can sit around the campfire and scare your friends, and you've got the best story in the room, and everybody gets goosebumps, and they make for great stories. And then people kind of go down this slippery slope where they can feel like, well, why is this happening to me and not my friends? And then you have this sort of chosen one mentality where there must be something special about me. And then they can get you that way because of that intrigue. And I have found with a lot of people that the reason why their sleep paralysis won't ever go away is because they won't stop talking about it. And in some perverted sense, they don't want it, but they really don't want it to go away either, if that makes sense. And
It's
you've
like
got these.
their claim to fame, and they're the star, and it, like you were saying,
Yeah.
makes them feel special. And so it's like, yeah, that's hard to give up when you go through every day, and it's like you're invincible to people. But then you mention this story, and everyone's like, all attention's on you.
Yeah, yeah. It's really hard. And especially when you get into the realms of the people that have fully embraced it and they're interacting with ascended masters and spiritual guides and things like that in the astral realm. And they're getting all sorts of arcane knowledge downloaded to them. And they're getting abilities and gifts from this realm. Once you start to build an entire identity around this, like it's who you are and it's why people are coming to you for counsel, and this is where you're deriving your self-esteem and your maybe even your whole livelihood, then it becomes even more difficult to unattach yourself from it, because then you sort of have somewhat of an identity crisis, like, well, who am I if I'm not this, you know, sidekick to this spiritual entity who thinks that I'm so wonderful and gifted and beautiful and necessary. I've got a gift, and I've got this role I'm playing in helping mankind evolve. And it's really hard to start letting go once you're that deep down the rabbit hole. But unfortunately, and this is the part they don't advertise, this is the small print. You can go online and listen to all sorts of amazing information about how to, go into the astral realm and get knowledge and get gifts and all this. What they don't tell you is the deeper and deeper you get into that, the more and more prone to these paranormal type experiences you're getting. A lot of people, they don't advertise it. They don't tell you that at the same time that they've got all of this information from spirit guides, they're also being harassed, and they're being visited in their bedrooms, and they're having sleep paralysis, and they're having incubus and succubus experiences, and they're having oppression and depression, and things in their life are seemingly falling apart. They don't want to advertise that part. That's the small print. That's the side effects to the medication, right? And it's usually when someone gets unentrenched from the new age and they come out of it that they will start to admit, like, this and this was happening. And my spirit guide, a lot of people will talk about a spirit guide that was wonderful and beautiful, They were full of love and light. But at some point, that relationship changes, and that spirit guide will show their true colors or their true visage. And then it becomes a more of a frightening experience, and the person is then caught in this realm of, there's aspects of this that I don't like and that I am afraid of, and that's hurting my mental health. But if I let it all go, I face this identity crisis, because if I was wrong about everything, and I've got all these followers that I've been leading down this path that I'm now responsible for, and if I'm not this special chosen one, then who am I? And it's a really, people don't understand when they get into it, because it's very exciting when you're first exploring it, and they don't understand that even if it takes a lot longer for some people, this is one of those things where it is always a wave that goes up. It apexes, it climaxes, and then it just goes down from there. And I always tell people that these entities will basically use you as long as you are useful to them. And that's why some people can be in this for 20 years without any negative consequences, and other people can be in it for 20 weeks and they're done. If you are useful to these entities, if you can help them accomplish their goals, if you have giftings that they need, if you can communicate messages to the public on their behalf, if you're useful to them, they will hold on to you as long as you are useful. But as soon as you cease to be useful for whatever reason, or their need for you is up, that is when you're going to start seeing the darker side of these beings of love and light.
Right. And I just want to make one thing kind of clear, is we're not saying every spirit guide or every, guardian or angel that you meet is this way. That there are some that come in the guise of. So I don't want people hearing this and, that have a great relationship with the spirit guide, who is a true spirit guide, who is there to help, doesn't do all of this, to freak out and say, oh, I had to cut you off because these people said this about you. I just want to make that clear, is we're not saying all. And so, yeah, because I know there are people out there who are probably hearing what you just said and said, oh my God, I had this guardian angel and the spirit guide that's been helping me all this time, and am I just being used? And it's like, no, you probably really do have a true guardian angel watching over you. We're not saying everything is out to get you at some point.
Yeah, well, what we really need to learn to do, and I don't find that a lot of people do this, is we have to test these spirits. And I know a lot of people that are involved in this stuff that they don't test the spirits. We base whether these things are helpful or unhelpful based upon how we feel or the experience we had. And human emotion is a very poor litmus test to determine whether or not something in a spiritual realm that we don't understand is for us or against us. So if we walk away from an experience and we feel good, or they presented themselves as something beautiful, or if they're nice to us, or if they say nice things to us, or if we walk away not being fearful, or no negative consequences have yet shown themselves, that's not an adequate litmus test. We have to go beyond that to test them. And, one example of this on the flip side of it is, if you go into the Bible and you look at guardian angels and seraphim sent from the throne of God to give messages to human beings. So they aren't nefarious. They're not out to hurt anybody. The most common thing that comes out of the mouth of an angelic being every time they encounter a human being in the Bible is, fear not, do not be afraid. And we have the people who are encountering good angels who are always terrified. They're fainting for fright. They're having to be revived. John, who wrote the book of Revelation, John was known as the disciple, the beloved disciple, the disciple that Jesus loved. He was very close to Jesus. When John saw Jesus again, on the island of Patmos, he saw a vision of Jesus sitting on the throne in his glorified body. This was his friend, this someone who loved him. And it said that John fell as a dead man because he was terrified. And so just encountering a spiritual being and judging how good or trustworthy or safe they are based on how beautiful they present themselves or how kind they are to us or how we felt during that experience, it's not a good litmus test, because we know from scriptures that you can encounter a good being and be terrified. There are encounters in scripture where Abraham, for example, when Abraham made his covenant with God, he's talking to Jehovah himself. In that context, it was probably the pre-incarnate Jesus he was talking to. And so here he is presented with the pre-incarnate Jesus. And it says that Abraham fell into a deep sleep and terror and darkness came over him. But it was a good encounter with a good being. So we need more than just this person's been really nice to me and they're beautiful and I feel really good afterwards and they've given me all this information. We need stronger litmus tests to test these spirits other than just our human emotions.
Right, and I totally understand that, and I agree. And I think one of the other things too is your discernment of, I've always tell people I trust my intuition and gut. And growing up as being in elementary school, middle school, everybody would say, "You're a guy. You don't have intuition. That's a feminine thing." And I was like, "I beg your pardon. I very well have a gut and an instinct, and it has served me very well. And I am very much a guy, and so I think you need to relook at that." But I mean and to me, that's another thing that I'm wondering that plays into the sleep paralysis and everything is our society has taught us stuff of, like, men can't be seen as weak. So if you're having paralysis, you're not going to tell anybody because that's a sign of weakness. And granted, nowadays that's, kind of gone to the wayside some, but I think it's still there. And so I think that's the other thing too is, people need to find outlets to talk about this, and and maybe they are experiencing sleep paralysis by other means or not, but they can't just ignore it.
Yeah. Oh, great point. You made so many good points in a row right there, Michael. And I've seen that as well. There has been a hesitation for several different reasons through the last several decades that people don't want to talk about this. Now, back in like the 50s to the 70s, people didn't talk about it because if you talked openly about it, you were diagnosed as schizophrenic. You were put away. You were heavily medicated and considered mentally ill, right? And if you talk about it in the church, you're perceived as a hypocrite, or you're hiding some dirty secret, right?
Or possessed.
Or possessed, exactly. And I know that a lot of people don't want to talk about their full encounter, and this is changing. But up until this point, people have been maybe willing to say, like, I have these bad dreams and they're really scary, or they might think it's demonic or whatever. But what they don't want to tell you is that there's a whole entire sexual encounter to it. Not all the time, but a lot of people, turns into incubus or succubus types of things. And there's a lot of this in the alien agenda as well, where people talk about the probes and the experiments and things. And people don't really necessarily want to admit all of their experience for sake of not being believed, being discredited, being mocked or made fun of, et cetera, et cetera. But to your point as well, it's this idea of also not wanting to be perceived weak, either intellectually, physically, or spiritually. it's almost like if I admit that I'm being attacked by these things, I've got a kink in my armor somewhere, right? And I'm just going to want to encourage your listeners. You're right, Michael. Most of the people that contact me and are willing to talk and wanting help, a large majority of the people that contact me are women. But interestingly, almost every man that has contacted me and has been willing to talk about it have been ex-military. And what's interesting to me about that, and which sort of blows this theory out of the water that men who have sleep paralysis are weak because they're scared. What's really interesting to me is that some of the strongest people in our society, these people that face war, they're the ones that have the courage to come forward and say, this is happening to me. And so it actually takes a lot of courage to talk about it. It's not weak. And some of the guys, Michael, will tell me that their reaction is anger, that when these things happen, they're like, what are you doing in my room? Like that, they do respond with more anger. But everyone I've ever talked to, if they're telling me the truth, they will say it was the most terrifying experience I've ever gone through. And, it's one thing to not be afraid of anything that we face in life. But these things that we're facing, if they're from other worlds or other dimensions or other spiritual planes, we're dealing with something that we're not familiar with, and we haven't really been educated. And we're dealing with beings that we don't fully understand. And so I think it's okay when we encounter something not of this world to be afraid. And I think sometimes fear is that discernment and intuition that you're talking about. If we decide, hey, I'm going to go and hang out in a back alley in the middle of a big city wearing a jacket made out of $100 bills, and you're not afraid, you're just dumb, right? You're just naive.
Right.
And so there's certain things we should be afraid to do. And so sometimes fear isn't weakness. Fear is discernment, and fear is that internal fire alarm that's going off telling us this is dangerous. And when we have an internal fire alarm that is telling us that something's dangerous, that is not a sign of weakness. That's a sign of discernment.
Right. And to me, like you bring up fear, fear is an emotion that helps us and hinders us.
Yeah.
And I find it only truly hinders us when we let it take control. So as long as you're in control of the fear, then it'll serve you and keep you safe. Because, I mean, like, a prime example is, when you're a kid, putting your hand on the hot stove and you get burned. You're not going to, you're going to think twice about putting your hand on that stove, whether it's on or not. And that's a fear that serves you.
Yes.
But if you sit there and say, I could never cook again because the stove will burn me,
Yeah.
that's the example of that fear has taken over your life, and that's not healthy.
Great analogy. Absolutely. Yep.
Now, when you mention the military, I wonder, as we're talking about these beings, use deception and trickery, could they be choosing the military because we're now coming to terms with, PTSD and all of those? And can a soldier be, say, had an IED go off nearby and now they can't sleep because they're petrified of that experience? Is that an example of sleep paralysis, or is that, just the fear that they're facing and dealing with, and can it be misdiagnosed?
Yeah, absolutely. Trauma-based narcolepsy, just the absolute inability to sleep, is much different. In the sleep paralysis scenario, you are actually being visited by some sort of an entity. And typically, it's an ominous visit. Sometimes they'll guise themselves as a seductress, in a succubus situation, etc. But what's interesting about the military is they are very close to high stress situations, PTSD, trauma. And I do think that that is sort of an energy draw. If you're going into the Robert Monroe, his theory of the loosh, where these negative entities are attracted to negative human emotion. And it's not just terror. It can be anger, rage. It can be lust. Any strong human emotion is what they are drawn to. And another interesting thing, though, about the military, though, is at least since the 1950s, if not before, the military has been militarizing and weaponizing astral projection. Now, they call it remote viewing, but it is astral projection. And in fact, Robert Monroe, when he was training the U.S. Army in the 80s how to astral project for the purposes of surveillance and weaponizing it, they had a very formal discussion on what they were going to rename it, because astral projection was too spiritual of a term, and they wanted a more layman's term for it. So they came up with the term remote viewing, but it's the same thing. And so I do think in the case of military that some of those sleep paralysis experiences might be a remote viewing. They might be training in remote viewing, or they might be one of the people that is being remote viewed, et cetera, et cetera. And I do think that there's a lot of people in the military. The military has all sorts of operations and tactics and things that they are experimenting, and they experiment on people in the military without their knowledge and permission. And there's like a long history of that. And so I do think in the case of people that have a lot of sleep paralysis in the military, absolutely it can be the high stress of wartime, or the PTSD of the people that have come back from the field, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also a militarized version of astral projection called remote viewing that is very prominent in the military and is utilized. And a lot of these soldiers are trained in that, if that's in their area. And so I think that some of it might not be a classic sleep paralysis experience in the form of actual entities, but it could actually be the militarized remote viewing.
True. And as we're talking about emotions with the soldiers, one that I think might be kind of mislabeled or overlooked to me would be the sorrow, because you're on the line with brothers and sisters now, and if one falls, you can't help but feel sorry, and feeling like that's the survivor's guilt, and the sadness of I need to get that person because of what they did to this. And yes, that could be defined as anger, but it's coming out of the sorrow.
Yes.
And so to me, it's like, that's an emotion too that soldiers are taught to bury and not,
Yes.
deal with. And, I think that from what I've been hearing with what you're saying and everything, could be another reason why they're able to get to the soldiers, is because we're not, training them to say, okay, take 3 days off of the line. Let's talk about what you're going through, the sadness, all of that. That we're just taught, when the war's over, you can mourn for everybody. But until then, just keep it bottled up, use it on the line. And I think that's, to me, is a disservice. I understand why they're doing it, because, you need everyone on the line. But at the same point, though, you need everyone on the line in the right space.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head again. Misery. Any type of misery can create an atmosphere for these types of experiences. And, when you live in a culture where science and medicine and even the church has ruled out the possibility of the paranormal or the supernatural, everything has to be, scientific method, stoic, Greek, stoic minded, step logic, there's a whole bunch of things that fall out of the purview of that in the human experience. And so when you get out of the military and you get all the counseling you need and you get the financial resources that you need, but you can't ever have any satisfactory explanation or healing for the supernatural things that occurred, it's just like you said, they've got to bury that part. And there's only so much of that you can detach from. And that's a big thing too. You know, you've got when you've got exorbitant amounts of trauma, the human brain has the ability to dissociate, and it's a way of surviving, right? And when we have these experiences as a child, whether if you're in the military or if you're in an abusive situation as a child or a dysfunctional situation as a child, and you are able to detach from those emotions, eventually that all that stuff that you've stuffed down there is going to come out and is going to have to be dealt with. We see this in grief also. There are people that don't want to deal with grief after they've lost a spouse or something, and so they'll move on with their life very quickly. They'll get remarried and they'll just, I'm not going to think about that. But it always does come back because it's an emotional cancer that just kind of rots, and eventually it will grow to the point. That's why you've got so many people, what we call it a midlife crisis, right? But there's so many people in the middle of life that have these breakdowns and these crises because they have just been told to soldier on through everything that they've gone through. And there's just a point in our life where our heart and our brain just can't carry the load anymore. And it kind of, the weight gives out from underneath it. And so with sleep paralysis, I do consider it a form of trauma. And a lot of times it is trauma on top of another trauma. It has been birthed out of trauma that was already there. And so the same way you would take dealing with unresolved trauma, I think that needs to be applied to sleep paralysis as well, because it is a traumatizing thing for people. And it's something where people are afraid to go to bed at night and they're afraid to sleep. They're afraid to ever get married because they're going to have to tell a spouse this, or their spouse is going to see this happening. And that's a really sad one for me, Michael. I get calls and emails from people where they're married, and in some cases, the spouse believes them. They've seen it happen. They're very supportive. But there's a lot of examples too where the spouse doesn't believe that there's anything supernatural there. They think the spouse is a drama queen. They think that it's just an attention-seeking device. They shut their emotions off. There's no compassion. And I've even heard from people where their marriages have broken up because of it, because the experiences are so intense. And so there's a lot of stuff on the peripheral. It's not just I woke up one night and had this scary experience and went on with my life. So for some people, this can get to the point where it ruins their life.
Now, I mean, we've talked about ways that you can prevent it and everything. And I'm curious for anyone who thinks, they may be suffering from sleep paralysis, whether intentional, unintentional, sleep deprivation, or, other means. Where can they go to seek help? I mean, who do they talk to or reach out to? Because, not everybody is aware enough to go, yeah, let me ask this person, hey, did you have this experience? Who did you talk to?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have many people to talk to, Michael. I remember, because this happened to me since I was like 3 years old. I finally confided in a friend in high school. I think I was like in 10th grade. And she was extremely compassionate and she believed me. But by the time she got back to school on Monday, she told me that she had talked to her mom about it. And her mom was a devout Catholic. And the mom had diagnosed me as being demon possessed, and I needed to have a priest come in and exorcise me, right? Which I did not do. And so, needless to say, I kind of realized at that point there wasn't really too many people I could tell this to. I think it's different now. I think there's more people that are aware of it. But, you can go to a doctor, but you're probably just going to get medicated, or you're going to get diagnosed as sleep apnea or something else, which might be part of the problem and it might help. But I I don't know that a sleep apnea machine is necessarily going to make the shadow person go away, right? If you go to a priest or a pastor, you're probably going to get gaslit. You're probably going to be told you've got a deep, dark, ugly, sinful secret that you've got to let go of, and that you're asking for it, and you've opened these doors. I know I'm overgeneralizing, and I know that there's pastors that do understand this, and I've talked to some of them, and they're learning, and they're on a learning curve. So I don't want to cast every doctor and every pastor in the same light. Then there's people that will go to more alternative. They'll seek mediums and things like that. But the problem with that is exactly what you brought up earlier, Michael, that when you've got someone in the house announcing there's a spirit of a child here, there's someone dead here, that it almost serves as a re-invitation. They're there sort of announcing this thing. And there's also a lot of ancient sort of mythological ideas of things that you can do that will scare demons away. And a lot of times it's actually the opposite. It's either of no value at all, it's just a wives' tale, or it actually does the opposite. It's actually more of a covenanting or an invitation. And so what I really try to convince people of is there's really nothing we can do to control the spiritual realm, right? I mean, we can't control through medicine or mythology or counseling, really. And it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier, Michael. The solution is really in us. We have the power to assess the change. So we have the ability to say, go away. I don't want to have anything to do with you. We have the power to ignore it and not continue to draw it or attract it. We have the ability within ourselves to decide, I don't want this to happen anymore, and I'm going to take matters into my hands. I just find that it's not that there's not people out there who can't be helpful, Michael, but I find that because so many people are uneducated on this, and a lot of the people that we're going to for help have never experienced it. And they might be nodding their head sympathetically as you're talking, but a lot of them are thinking in their mind that this person's crazy, or I'll bet they're on drugs, or, do you have any mental illness in your family background? They, just by the questions they're asking, they're trying to get to this Occam's razor easiest solution. They don't want to really think about it in terms of the supernatural. And a lot of the people that are willing to think of it in terms of the supernatural are unwittingly going to just perpetuate the situation because it's drawing more attention to it. And so I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, because we all want to know that book or that person we can go to. But it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, our discernment. And a lot of times, I'll use a human example. There are so many times when I will talk to friends of mine who have gotten themselves into a bad relationship. And when they are finally willing to admit this was a really bad relationship and I need to break up, they will often at that point start telling you all the red flags they saw along the way that they ignored because they didn't want to see them, right?
Right.
And it's the same thing with the sleep paralysis. When you're talking earlier about discernment and intuition, here's the problem. Most of us have a spot on discernment. We do have an intuition, and hundreds of little red flags are creeping up along the way as we're delving into these things. But we ignore them because it's exciting. This is an adventure. This is cool. Whatever's drawing us to this stuff. It's getting me a lot of hits on social media. We all have our reasons why we're attracted to this stuff. And it's usually when it blows up in our face that we're then willing to admit, well, here's the 100 red flags that I had the discernment to pick up on, but ignored. And that's the problem that a lot of us have, Michael. It's not that we don't have the discernment or that we don't know that a lot of this stuff is dangerous or a lot of this stuff isn't as friendly as we think. It's that we ignore those red flags because it hasn't bit us in the butt yet. And until it bites us in the butt, it's worth kind of the risk and the adventure and the excitement of it, because we are getting something out of it to that point. Even if it's scary, even if we have some encounters where we're like, I don't know about that, it's the excitement of it. It's the draw of it. And so what I would tell a lot of people, the advice I would give and how I would answer that question now is, please listen to that intuition in your head. If you have thoughts in the back of your head, like this might not be a good idea, or, that thing my spirit guide just said actually contradicts something that they already said, but no. It must be me. I'm not getting it right. We've got to put the clues together, and we've got to, it's not a problem of I need to get discernment. Most of us already have it. The problem is that most of us are not good about heeding our own discerning counsel, right? That's why we get into these horrible relationships that are hard to get out of, and all of this, So just what I'd say is really cultivate discernment and cultivate the self-discipline that it takes to test these spirits and test these red flags, so that you can get yourself out of these situations at level 1 of the video game instead of level 20, because it's a lot harder to back out when you're 20 rooms into it than when the front door is right behind you.
Right. And we're approaching the end of the hour. I don't know if you have time to go a little bit over or not.
Sure.
So, with that being said, one thing I'm curious about is, like you were saying, when you're rested, in a good headspace and everything, can a sign that a sleep paralysis is coming be that all of a sudden you stop sleeping so well, and it's like you have 2 or 3 nights where you're all of a sudden just random not sleeping at all? Could they be messing with your sleep pattern to weaken you?
That's a really good point. I mean, nothing would go past me by way of what they do to wear us out. That's a really good point. I've never really thought about that, Michael, because there are times where I'm not experiencing sleep paralysis at all, but for no reason whatsoever, I am not getting good sleep and I can't get good sleep. And I never really thought about it in terms of, are they priming the pump to get me into that state of exhaustion? And that's a really good thought. And I'm going to kind of test that theory out, because I have not really been able to fall asleep much before 3 or 4 in the morning the last few nights, and it's completely inexplicable. There's nothing stressful going on or whatever. And so I'm actually going to bear that in mind and kind of test that in the real world. That's a really good point. And it wouldn't surprise me if that's what's happening. But it's also important that for people who encounter the paranormal and the supernatural a lot, it's really hard for us to sort of accept boring, unexciting explanations for certain things. You kind of get into the habit of wanting some sort of really exciting supernatural explanation to everything going on. I'll give you a little example. I remember one job that I had a coworker tell me, "Vicki, I have a demon in my room. Every night at this particular time when the lights go out, I hear this noise." And I told her, I said, "Well, sounds like mice in the walls." And she's like, no. And she was so disappointed because she wanted the Christian who knew about spiritual warfare to give her this exciting ghost story. It's almost like she wanted, and maybe this goes back to our fear of weakness too. I'm not afraid of a mouse, so this has to be a ghost in my house, because I'm allowed to be afraid of ghosts, but like, who's afraid of a mouse, right? So she wanted this really supernatural explanation for it. And she ended up telling me that a couple weeks later, she found mouse poop all over inside her bedroom dresser. And so it had been a mouse, right?
Right.
And so I think sometimes I have seen some people, Michael, and this goes back to what you were saying about just being able to clean the space and drop the subject. There are people that I know personally who have to come up with an extremely far-reaching, extremely complicated supernatural explanation for a lot of the things going on in their life. And I'm not going to psychoanalyze why that's happening, but I do find that those people tend to get more harassment, because I do think that these things to a certain degree are attention seeking. And to the degree that we can, I don't mean ignore it, like don't do anything to get healing or help, but ignoring them by way of the attention that you're giving. And I'm going to give another example. Early on, about a year ago, I was on another podcast, and it was hosted by a couple. And they were paranormal researchers, and they would go to graveyards, and they would do like investigations and things. And they told me a story. This was so fascinating to me. They told me a story that at one point they were doing an investigation in a graveyard, and something attached, some sort of spirit attached. And when they came home, they started experiencing pretty intense paranormal activity in their house. And the more it happened, the more and more they were talking about it, and the more they were saging, and they were doing all of these rituals and everything. And the more and more and more they did, the worse and worse it got. And one day this guy came up with this brilliant idea. And so he said to his spouse, he said, I think we're giving this thing so much attention, and it's thriving on the attention. I think it's actually thriving on the attention. And so they made a pact to never mention it out loud ever again, and not talk about it. And if something paranormal happened, they weren't going to look at each other. They weren't going to exchange glances. They weren't going to say like, they were going to completely ignore this thing, the same way you would ignore a child who's like begging for attention. And they said that it did take a little bit of time, like it took a week or two or something like that. But eventually, when they determined to ignore this thing, it went away and it never came back. And so I do think sometimes we can be our own worst enemies, and we can fixate on this stuff so much, which is easy to do because it is scary. But I think sometimes that is actually just encouraging the entity, because I do think that they thrive on attention.
Right. And one thing that just popped in my mind was I always would use the phrase, under universal law, you have to leave. And it was like my way of saying, there's no leeway. There's, this. But I like how you put, we don't even have to go to that degree. Just simply say gone is enough. We don't have to go to the ends of, making this stand, where, they say stand in your power, and making it look like, we're becoming the statuesque, godlike figure that's standing up and saying everything's going to go around me now. That it's just simply just have to say it, and the intention behind it. That's the other thing that I think a lot of people don't agree or don't understand is I can sit here all day long and say gone, gone, gone. But in my mind, if I'm like going, yeah, I said gone, but did it really work? Then you open the door. And so it's like that self-doubt and is a killer amongst humans. And, let me clarify, I don't mean like kill as in end results, but it undoes all the work that you've just done. And that's the one thing that I've always tried to stress to people is if you're going to clean your space, you have to 100% be behind your cleaning the space. Just a simple 0.5% will undo it and cause it not to work. And
these beings, these entities are extraordinarily legalistic. And unfortunately, they know more of the rules than we do, which is why they can get by with so much of what they get by with, and why they can get us to open doors so easily when we're unwitting that we're doing it. They're extremely legalistic. And what I have found, and this plays into what you were just saying, is I know people in religious circles, and they're doing the best that they can. They're doing what they think is the best. But what's sort of taught in the church, and what a lot of them do is, okay, before I go to bed tonight, I don't want sleep paralysis. So before they go to bed, they fall asleep praying, God, don't let me have sleep paralysis tonight, and don't let any demons come into my room, and don't let me and they end up falling asleep, basically meditating on all of these negative things that they don't want to have happen to them. And it sort of creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then they turn around and say, well, this doesn't work. Prayer doesn't work. Jesus doesn't work. And it's not that he doesn't work. It's that you are meditating on all of this negative stuff as you're falling asleep. And that's just the way the brain works. If there's a lot of bleed over. Like a lot of times if we're watching something before we go to bed, that character will show up in our dream, or conversations we had during that day will show up in our dream. There's this bleed over. So what I find is the simpler, the better. Like what you're saying, like get out, as opposed to all of this rigmarole. Because these things are legalistic, what I have found, and I've learned this the hard way, if you start playing this game where you're going to tell an entity every single thing that they're not allowed to do, they will find the one thing you forgot to say or the one thing you don't know about, and then they'll just try it at that angle. So an example of this in my life is after my mom died, I started having a bunch of nightmares about my mom. And so one night I prayed and I said, God, don't let me have another nightmare about my mom. They're too much. I can't take it. Don't let me have a nightmare about my mom. So that night I did not have a nightmare about my mom, but I had a nightmare about another person in my life who had ghosted me and had hurt me very, very badly. So it was a different character that showed up in my dream, but it was the same theme. It was still a dream where it was pulling a scab off of a deep loss. So the next night I said, God, please don't let me dream about my mother or this person. And so that night I didn't dream about my mom or that person, but another loss, a rejection from my past came into my dreams. And I realized I'm not going to stay up and pray 3 hours and have to remember every single name of every person in my life who ever hurt me that could show up in a dream and trigger me. So I kind of realized at that point that these things are legalistic. And so if you try to beat them at their own game, they will become so legalistic. Well, you never said I couldn't do this. There's almost this childlike impishness in them that you never said I couldn't do this. So this whole idea where we have to somehow encapsulate in a mantra or in a prayer every single thing that we don't want them to do, it really becomes a slippery slope, because once you start that game with them, they've got you by the short hairs, because they can think of 100 things that you can't remember or that you don't know about. And so I find that the simpler, the better. Get out. And we don't have to sit and have conversations with them. We don't have to give them the whole entire diatribe. Just get out. You do not have my permission. I do not consent is when I have sleep paralysis experiences where I'm pulled into the astral against my will, and I'm interacting with beings there who want me to say things or do things or come with me or here, eat this or drink this tea or make this. I say, I do not consent, and bang, I wake up. As soon as they know that they don't have your permission, their hands are tied.
That's a good one to know and to think about. And one question I have for you that I find interesting for me personally is I have sleep apnea. Never knew I had it. And so I would be sleeping and people would be like in the morning, if I was around people, would be freaking out and going, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I'm totally rested. I feel great. What's going on? And they're like, you stopped breathing so many times last night. We were like really worried about you. And I was like,
Ooh.
And they're like, you got sleep apnea. You need to go get tested. And I was like, thought nothing. I was just like, well, maybe it was a bad night, just didn't sleep really well as I thought I did. And, then some other people would tell me the same thing. So I finally decided, yeah, I'll go get tested and find out I do have it. And I noticed I used to keep a log, and every night would be like 0.7 events per hour or 3 events per hour. And in talking with, and listening to what you're saying, I'm wondering if those events per hour are not me not breathing, but having a sleep paralysis episode and I'm not even aware of it. Like, is that possible?
It's certainly possible, Michael, and maybe not every single iteration of it. And, just for the record, both of us, neither of us are saying that if you have sleep apnea, you're being encountered in the astral every single time. But,
Right.
but what I do notice and what I have asked, and it seems weird whenever I interface with someone who has habitual sleep paralysis, I will ask them a series of questions that has to do with their breathing. And I will ask them, like, do you have sleep apnea? Do you have any sort of sleeping disorder or narcolepsy? Do you have problems breathing out of your nose? Are you a mouth breather? And things like that. And to this point, Michael, everyone that I have asked, with the exception of one person, every single person who I have talked to who's had lifelong sleep paralysis has some sort of diagnosed issue with breathing. Not necessarily a sleep disorder, but there is a breathing issue. In my case, because of all the reconstructive surgery I had growing up, I never really breathed out of my nose very much because it felt very panicky to me. And so I was kind of naturally this mouth breather. And a lot of people, when they talk about sleep paralysis, they say, I felt like I was being suffocated. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I felt like my lungs were collapsing. I felt like I was being choked. A lot of us wake up in the supine position on our back with our necks like crimped, and we're breathing heavily out of our mouths. The saliva is all dried up in the middle of our mouth, in our mouth. And so there is a strong connection, I believe, to the breath. And we know that the breath is life. And we know that there is something very spiritual to the breath. In fact, if you go into the Greek, the word pneuma, it means spirit or breath. It's the same word. So in Greek, if you want to say spirit, you say pneuma. If you want to say breath, you say pneuma. So there's a deep spiritual connection between our breath and our spirit. And so when we're being attacked, our breathing is being affected by that. And so I absolutely believe that these entities are also very good at hiding behind medical diagnoses. In other words, they ride the tails of, or they mimic symptoms of other diseases, so that when you go to a doctor and say, I have this, and this, they will easily diagnose you as, well, you're schizophrenic, or you have epilepsy, or you have sleep apnea, because it's all of the same symptoms. And this doesn't mean that you don't have epilepsy, or you don't have schizophrenia, or you don't have sleep apnea. But what I'm saying is, when they can ride in on the coattails of those other symptoms, you can attack those physical symptoms with medication and with like machines and things like that. But it's not necessarily going to take the spirit. It's not going to heal the spiritual aspect of it, because it's actually something riding on the coattails of it. And there's several examples of that in the New Testament, where people would come to Jesus, they would want to be healed. And so they would come to him and they'd be blind, or they would be mute, or they would have seizures. And a vast majority of the time, Jesus would heal them of an illness. But occasionally, when they would come to him, instead of healing them, he would cast out a demon, which indicated that he knew the difference, and that in some cases, the malady was not an actual medical diagnosis, but it was actually some sort of entity causing that. And the way that the entity was manifesting was mimicking symptoms of a common disease as a way of being covert, right? Because you can't, if somebody knows, like, let's say you have a demon inside of you. If someone knows that and they have the ability to cast that demon out, that demon doesn't want to be cast out. So it's going to hide behind something. And so that's just a metaphor, you guys. I'm not saying that people that have sleep paralysis are demon possessed. I'm just saying that these entities, if they're looking for host bodies, or they're looking to have some sort of a human connection during these experiences, they're going to want you to diagnose everything else before you figure out that that's something supernatural or something spiritual, because they don't want to be found out, and they don't want to hear the words "go away" or "I don't consent." So they're very good at riding on the coattails of symptoms of very common medical maladies.
Okay, and I'm kind of curious. I might be going into a realm of something where you may not be familiar with or comfortable going, but I'm wondering because being a history major, I see patterns and I
Okay.
see like different aspects. And for one example, like we have sleep apnea, we have obesity, we have all these diseases that are fairly new that everyone
Hmm.
thinks have been around forever, but they've really only been around for like the last 100 years. Could it be that, for example, and I'm not saying this is fact, this is just theory, could an entity be going into like somebody and saying, okay, we're now going to call it this. And so we're going to do this so we can hide what we're doing under this, and you're going to help us. And that's why all of a sudden, because like in the pre colonial days, in the colonial age, you never heard of sleep paralysis, you never heard of sleep apnea, or I mean, the most breathing was pneumonia. That was it. Now we have
Hmm.
bronchitis, we have asthma. And could it be that these diseases are not really as prominent as we think they are, that they're covering up something else?
Yeah.
Like, the sleep paralysis aspect.
Yeah. This is a great question. And I have thought about this a lot, and it's controversial. And I want to say this in a way where I'm not triggering people, because my intent here isn't to be controversial or divisive at all. But this is a good question, and it's one we have to answer, because way back in antiquity, physical ailments and spiritual ailments weren't considered two different schools of thought. Uh, in ancient times, the healing facilities were temples and the physicians were high priests. And this was on the Christian end of things and the non-Christian end of things. You had the temple in the Old Testament where you'd go to the high priest if you had leprosy, and the high priest is one that would cleanse people. But you also had the Asclepions, and you had the people going into these healing temples. And Galen, the super surgeon of the 2nd century, he was a super surgeon, but he basically facilitated astral projection into dreaming a cure. You would be sedated and you would dream a cure. And so the medical world and the spiritual world were always connected. And it's only in our generation that we think that they need to be separated. So before we really delve into this too deeply, I want everyone to understand that when we talk about demon possession, if you say demon possession, everybody thinks The Exorcist, right? They think of horror movies, and they think of people screaming swear words at priests and spitting up pea soup and all of this stuff, right? When we talk about some of these mental illnesses, or these illnesses that you're talking about, are these entities masking behind these physical ailments? We're not talking about demon possession in the same sense that a demon is completely taken over your body, and you'll if you see a cross and all this stuff. We're talking about what there's a difference between being demon possessed and being demonized. Okay, so in in the realms of deliverance ministry, people that go and actually deliver people from demonic oppression, you can be demonically oppressed or demonized, and that doesn't mean that there's a demon living in you and you're a host body and it's feeding what you should say and you're just a puppet and this and that. So demonization, I actually think that it's possible to be demonized or demon oppressed and not know it. And the reason you cannot know it is because we have so many practical, logical labels and explanations for these things now. And because we've taken the supernatural out of science, we've taken the supernatural out of medicine, and we've taken the supernatural out of the church, it's just not on anybody's list to check off as to, could this be something spiritual? And so to your point, and I know this is a controversial statement, and I'm not saying it with authority, But I have speculated, Michael, if this getting way out of hand DSM-5 manual, the mental illness Bible, where every year just it has to constantly be revised because more and more and more and more mental illnesses are being, invented or discovered. I am just wondering if we have so many people out there that are potentially have attachments or open doors, or they're being oppressed or harassed or targeted, whether through the occult, through the military, through the spirit realm. And they're manifesting all of these symptoms that look like mental illness. I mean, 75 years ago, if you had sleep paralysis, you would be schizophrenic. But you're not. Like, I've had sleep paralysis my whole life. I'm not schizophrenic. I would pass any mental illness test you gave me. I'm completely of sound mind, other than the fact that I have these experiences. And so I do think that there is a point where I'm not saying it's a cover up. It's a conspiracy. But what I'm saying is, I think that because we're not allowed to consider the supernatural anymore, that when more and more patients come in spiritually oppressed, and it's manifesting in hearing voices or not being able to sleep or having seizures that are related to third eye awakenings or kundalini awakenings, that because we can't explain it spiritually, we have to somehow explain it, but we can't really explain it physically because it's not really medical. And so now we have this whole entire booming multi-billion-dollar mental illness industry, replete with its own Bible, filled with all of these ever increasing labels of mental illnesses that you have. And I just really don't think that there's thousands of mental illnesses out there. And I think that in some cases there could be one explanation to a lot of these things. And kind of like what we were talking about earlier about clearing the space and taking good care of your body and eliminating stress and negativity in your life. And we know just from it, if you're a negative, angry person, or if you ruminate all the time on negative things, that kind of takes over your mind and your personality. And it can have a physical effect. I mean, people that are scared to death all the time of being sick often get sick. And there is sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy and this nocebo effect that can happen. I think that a lot of this can be nocebo effect, where if you're sitting and ruminating all day long on your anxieties and your hurts and your fears, that is going to manifest mentally and physically. And it's not necessarily that you're mentally ill, it's that you're ruminating on all of this negativity, and it becomes a nocebo effect. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I do think that there is something to what you're speculating there, Michael, and that it's not that people can't, it's not that everyone with sleep apnea is getting a visitation every night. It's not that everyone with a seizure is having a kundalini awakening. But what I'm saying is that a lot of people, we don't live in a culture where we're ever educated to even ask the question, could there be something supernatural behind my issue? Because another thing that I'm seeing in a lot of people that have had sleep paralysis their whole life is a lot of us have autoimmune issues as well. But that could just be that a lot of people with autoimmune also had a lot of childhood trauma. And it could just be that autoimmune disease is a physical manifestation of unresolved trauma, and the sleep paralysis is a spiritual or a mental consequence of that. So it's not necessarily that sleep paralysis causes autoimmune disease so much as the root of it might more be unresolved or even unremembered trauma.
Right. And one of the reasons why I asked that question is because the way my metaphysical brain works is like, you take an inhaler for asthma. You take, and it's something you're always with, but then the inhaler doesn't work. Well, if the inhaler is a device that's supposed to clear the airwaves and all of a sudden it's not working after several years of working, and they go, oh, we just need to change the medicine. That's why I was thinking, is it not medical? Because in my mind, I remember the days of, you know, when you got sick with something, they gave you one vaccine or one treatment and the disease was gone.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're still here and they're still manifesting. And so that's why I'm like, wait a minute, if medicine's not helping and their answer is let's change the medication, that's why I was thinking, is it something else? And it's not medical
Yeah.
because all of a sudden the treatments aren't working.
Yeah, it's a really good point. On one hand, we're not telling people to like stop going to the doctor. We're not Christian scientists here who say have faith and everything will get healed. But
Right.
what
And
we
we're not
are
saying
saying,
stop your medicine either.
right, exactly. What we are saying is, in addition to the medical protocol that you're already on right now, also ask the question, could there be something spiritual here? Do I have some unresolved trauma that I haven't worked through? Unresolved trauma will have a physical effect on your body, and healing from physical trauma or healing from trauma will have a physical effect on your healing. I mean, there are extraordinary stories out there of people who, when they were finally able to like forgive someone who they had a bitter grudge against, certain physical ailments went away. There's all kinds of stories out there, even outside of the religious circles. And so I just think that in addition to everything that we're doing to take care of our physical and mental health, why aren't we also asking the questions about could there be something spiritual to this as well? Is there maybe 3 legs to this table instead of just 2?
I agree. And Flixlove makes a interesting point of only if they train psychologists to develop their third eye, they might start to consider. And that goes back to the point of what we were saying earlier of we talk about a system of oneness and we're trying to become one with everything. But we live in a society that creates a dualism. And so there's a schism. And so I think that I can't help but think, everyone thinking, yeah, there's the good side, the bad side. There's you have to have two sides to every coin. We're always taught everything is double or two to create balance. And I've now started thinking, fairly recently, going, is that a construct of like a matrix that we're living in that we're taught versus the realism of balance is oneness? And that concept being, something that, like you were saying, the closer you get to something where if you are being visited, the closer you get to an answer, the harder they're going to fight against it. And so that's why all of a sudden it's like some people may be having more episodes than not, is because they're mentally starting to shift and they don't like it.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I personally think that duality is a man-made construct, and I think it's a thought prison. And I think that we're basically cerebrally enslaved by that concept. And I don't even think that that concept is true. And one of the things that I start my book out with is I say that one of the problems with the reason we haven't really gotten to the bottom of the sleep paralysis thing is because there's 2 explanations. There's the medical and scientific explanation over here, and there's the religious explanation over here. If you're over here, it can be medicated, or it's a delusion, or you're having hallucinations, or it's a mental illness, or it's narcolepsy. And over here, it's demons in your room. And until these 2 people want to get together and have an intellectually honest discussion and share notes and get all of the pieces to the puzzle, we're never going to figure this stuff out. And so it's this forcing us to see the black or the white, the left or the right, the A or the B. It's this, there's a duality and you got to pick one of them. And in addition to what you said, Michael, with unity and oneness, and that gets into the whole quantum entanglement of the universe, there's also this idea that there's some things in life that have complexities and there's more than two options, and we're stuck having to always pick between A and B, but sometimes there's a C, sometimes there's a D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Like there's not always just two choices or two solutions or two systems of thought. And I do think that this concept of duality, it's great if you're the one wielding it and you're using it to control people. But if you're the one being controlled by it, I believe that it is a thought prison.
Right. And going back to, so we were talking backstage about how we have to be careful what we say because a single word can get you deplatformed or anything. And the reason I bring that up is Derek Galloway has a comment, but I have to say with YouTube and, just dealing with Facebook right now, I don't want to put it up because of the one word in there. And one of the channels that I watch, he'll make a sound instead of that word.
Yes.
And it's but I feel it's worth saying is he says, yes, they try and instill fear. My mom just got prescribed a Z-Pack for a cold, and they wanted to give her a test. It's ridiculous. And and I think that's true is, and that goes back to like we were saying, are we truly being led by people, or are we being led by people who are connected, like you were saying, to these attachments who you were commenting before? They may not be aware of it. They could have their parents done ritual before they were born, and they're carrying out that agenda. And are they even aware that they're a part of that agenda against their will? Or, are they saying, hey, this agenda serves me, so I'm going to do it even though it hurts everybody else?
Yeah. I think it is so much deeper now. I think some people have become aware of the fact that we're on puppet strings. But what I think a lot of people haven't realized is we're on puppet strings, but that puppeteer is on puppet strings. Right. And that puppeteer is on puppet strings. And so it's not just we're down here doing the dance because the elite people are doing this to us. The elite people are on puppet strings. And the entities and forces that have the elites on puppet strings are on puppet strings. And it just goes so much deeper than that. So to try to get to the bottom, or I should say to the top, of who's ultimately holding that one puppet string that holds them all, we all have our own ideas of who that ultimate puppeteer is. But so many people are so focused on the one person holding their puppet strings that they don't realize that it's an infinite number of puppeteers along the way. But by the time it gets all the way down at the bottom where we're at, right?
Right. Well, I just, I've been enjoying this and everything, and I just realized we are an hour and 34 minutes almost. And so I want to thank you for coming on and thank everyone in the chat room and those who watched. And I have so enjoyed talking with you, and you were right. It was a fun episode, in my opinion, and we hit so many things, and I feel like there's more. So if you ever want back on the show, I'll be happy to have you back on.
Would love that, Michael. Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and Flick says he loves your name, Vicki Joy.
Thank you. Thank you. I always tell people I had to work so hard for that joy in my life that when I finally got it, I'm using that name. I earned it.
Well earned, too.
Thanks.
So we are going to sign out now and say good. And I usually come up with a clever way to say goodnight, but tonight, with everything we've been talking about, I'm just going to simply say blessings to everyone and have a wonderful day, afternoon, night, and peaceful dreams, everyone. Good night, everyone.
You have just listened to The Energy That Surrounds Us with your host, Michael Kopf. Be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.